Hi, everyone. Welcome to round two of this week. Today, we're going to be talking about ideographs, as you can tell. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by talking a little bit about why McGee developed ideographs. So before I get into defining it, which most of you did a great job of in your questions, I want you to know a little bit about the first couple of pages, what he's trying to say about his rationale. Then we'll get into the definition, and then of course understanding the vertical and horizontal poles of ideographs. And then I'll try, even though this is easier to do in a class, I'll try to identify how ideographs are affecting politics today by using a few examples. All right, so to get things started, in the first couple of pages, what McGee is trying to do is he's trying to tell you that there's problems with those who study symbolism, which think about symbolism, for the sake of this, as interchangeable with dramatism. All right, so anytime he's using the word symbolism, or maybe he talks about something like a myth, he is talking about, one example of that would be dramatism. Okay, so he's talking about that concept from Burke where we are all actors in a play, right? The concept that's focusing on the individual actor. And then he's criticizing that side of things, but he's also criticizing Marxism, which, think about this, is interchangeable with that ideology reading that we had from last week. So we spent some time, and what he's telling us here is that with dramatism, the problem is that they haven't really spent enough time focusing on what has happened systemically and what has happened historically, right? So dramatism sort of has this individual actor. And yes, in this case, they do talk about context a little bit, but McGee would say that they haven't really focused on that enough. It's too much about the individual. And then on the flip side, ideology is too much about this big system, right? And they don't really spend a lot of time talking about how the individual acts within the system. And so he's criticized both of these, right? Dramatism, too focused on the individual. Ideology is too focused on the system. And he's also saying, after those two criticisms, that there are a lot of theorists that believe that you have to think one way or the other. So either you fall on the symbolism, dramatism side of things, or you follow on the Marxist ideology side of things. McGee has decided, let's bring them together and let's try to create this concept that allows for us to understand how dramatism and ideology work together. So he says this, I know this is a really dense reading, it's hard to get into, but he's saying this on the first couple of pages, so page 36 and 37. And in fact, in one of the stars that I have on page 37, he says, I do believe, however, that each of us is erred to the extent that we have conceived to the rubrics of symbolism as an alternative rather than supplemental description of political consciousness. So what he's saying there is no, they should be supplemental. They should be working together. And he sort of expands on this still on 37 when he's talking about how one has overestimated power. Marxism overestimates power, and Burke discusses us as sort of these free individuals without discussing this political consciousness that is in Marxism. Okay, so he has said, Eureka, I'm the smartest person in the world. I've decided to bridge the gap and bring them together. So that's what this whole paper is about. And this concept of ideograph is about trying to figure out how we can bring these together. And so what he's done through his term ideograph, so usually in groups we do this in class, but you don't have to do that because you're not in my class. You're only online. Anyway, so with ideographs, what he's done is, so he defines it as the building block for ideology. He defines it like that on page 39 on the left side. You probably see my handwriting defined. Hopefully that was pretty clear. But think about this as the way individuals, so the way actors use specific words to help build ideology. So again, the way that an individual actor uses specific words to build ideology. So sort of to maintain this structure of power. Right? So typically, again, they're the building blocks of ideology. Typically an ideograph is a word or a phrase, right? According to McGee. So think about this as like, I mean, it could really be any word, but he's looking at words that have been used over and over. So if we have an actor that's used a word once, and it's an actor like you or me that doesn't have a lot of power, that's going to mean nothing, even if we use the same word over and over and over again, right? On Mean Girls, they say like, stop trying to make I think it's fetch a thing, right? So that's an example of someone trying to create an ideograph, but because they didn't have enough power, it didn't really take off, right? To really understand ideographs and for something to really become an ideograph, it has to be something that's used by people in power as well as like everyday people over and over again, so that it's sort of built up this really strong, powerful meaning. He gives you a lot of different examples that I think are, because he's written this a while ago, they're a little bit harder to connect with. Like, I think he uses rule of law a lot. But some things that I think we could connect with a little bit more are things like liberty, right? Or freedom, or patriotism. An ideograph is one of those words that, like, you could look it up in the dictionary and it would have like a very specific meaning. But the real meaning and the reason why we study these words, it has to do with the way that it's been used throughout time and the way that it's being used today. So some really good examples like that I think get used a lot now. Make America Great Again is an excellent example of an ideograph that is still pretty new. Obamacare is an excellent example of an ideograph, and it's a good example of one that has sort of shifted throughout time, right? So for a while it had a negative connotation and Republicans had power when they used it. Then Democrats and Obama sort of took it over and said, actually, I don't really mind it. But we still sort of, all of that history behind Obamacare and that development, it's tied, it weighs that word down. Right? I do think rule of law still functions in this way. It's just not as popular as some of those more catchy like slogans. But when we hear the word rule of law, it's definitely attached to, or like law and order, it's definitely attached to like the police system. So right away, like, I don't have to refer to the police. You will just think of it when you hear law and order, right? And so when like Donald Trump called himself like the law and order candidate for a while, he wasn't just saying like, okay, right now we need this because of all the police brutality that was going on, et cetera, et cetera. He was also calling up when people like Nixon utilized that phrase, right? And so those of us who are younger probably don't remember that. We might not be familiar with the weight that that phrase holds. But now that you've read some of this, you can see how important that phrase is to people who have been around longer. Okay, so before I give you some more examples, or before I try to like show you how these things function today politically, I want to make sure that we get into the vertical and horizontal analysis of an ideograph. So I've been alluding to this without actually using the words yet, but the vertical pole of an ideograph, so when I say pole, I mean like pole, not, so P-U-L-L, not P-O-L-E. This is the historical pole. So this is the way the phrase has been used throughout time, and how it's maybe changed throughout time. The horizontal pole is what's going on right now and how that affects the way that somebody's going to use it. So think about the vertical pole as like the attachment to ideology, right? So as we've used it throughout history, we've built this big system. The horizontal pole is about how individuals have chosen to use it currently. So we might use the pin tag to understand why someone is using the phrase Obamacare at this particular moment, right? And of course, it's going to depend on like if it's a Republican or Democrat. Right? So most of you got something like this correct, but I want to make sure I point this out to you in the reading before we talk about some more examples of ideographs. Okay, so in the reading, you can find this on page 41 on the right. And, you know, I've sort of like highlighted, so hopefully you can all use my highlights in this reading and you can sort of see these things. But like there's a spot here that says, considered rhetorically as forces, ideographs seem structured horizontally when people actually make use of them presently. So when people are using them now, they're structured horizontally. Let's see. Okay. And then it also talks about the vertical analysis, like the historical pull, a little bit later in that same paragraph. So hopefully those of you who are like looking for quotes for explaining this in more detail, if you're going to use this for your paper, hopefully you can use that little bit of information. So let's talk about a few examples of ideographs that maybe I haven't mentioned yet. So Make America Great Again, Obamacare, those are both really good ones. You could also use something like, you could use an individual. So for example, when people use Ronald Reagan, all of his choices and his popularity at the time are attached to the choice of using Ronald Reagan, right? And what's interesting about using Ronald Reagan is some people see him as a centrist, right? Some people would disagree with that, but because some people see him as a centrist, when both Democrats or Republicans use Ronald Reagan, they're using all of that centrist history that's attached to him, but horizontally what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, look at me, I'm still somewhere in the middle. I'm not too scary, right? So that what they're trying to do is they're trying to reach out to people who are maybe independent voters that are not on the right, not on the left, so they can say that they're sort of willing to bridge gaps, right? So that can be useful sometimes to use maybe a past president, right? And you're sort of banking on whatever they had passed at that particular time, and you're hoping that people are going to remember that, right? I mean, as we get older and older, that stuff will start affecting us. Like when people throw out Bill Clinton's name, right? Especially in the Democrats. Right now, it's sort of out of fashion because of some of the sexual assault allegations that are attached to his name. But people still use him. And what's interesting is people still use him to reach out to Black voters, right? In fact, I think Hillary Clinton thought that that was really going to help her campaign. And again, because he was so popular with Black voters, we're using that sort of historical pull of his name, right? And perhaps we're risking what his name means today if we decide to use it today, right? We're going to weigh out whether that historical pull is worth the current context. And for some people, it might be, right? Some people, that risk is something they're willing to take, especially people who are sort of in the center. Let's see. Another example I want to give to you is Yes, We Can. So imagine, so this is still a relatively new one, but immediately when I say yes, we can, or even the word hope, because Obama's campaign used that, that's always going to be attached to him. But it's also has sort of an attachment to like the feminist movement, right? Which is something they sort of used that for a while. So even when he was using it, it had some historical pull. But today, when some of the Democratic candidates use Yes, We Can, Julian Castro, I think, has used this a couple of times. They're banking on that historical pull of Obama, right? Without having to actually say his name. They're sort of showing that they have like, you know, he's my buddy. And then they're also using the current context of how we have a president who was anti-Obama even before he had decided to run for president. So these things, each ideograph is going to have something that is going to have a vertical and a horizontal pull. It's not one or the other. That's a really important thing that I think some people were sort of screwing up is, you know, you look for one or the other. If it's an ideograph, it has to have both, okay? All right, so hopefully that helps a little bit. The other thing I want to throw out there, and this is something that's controversial, and in class we would have time to like dialogue about this a little bit more, but some people might suggest that photos could be ideographs, especially in like the day that we live in now. This article was written in the early 80s, so this is before social media, before the internet, and I would say that yes, ideographs have become photos as well, like this picture, which was used for the Women's March, but because of the design, has similarities with the Obama campaign. It's already sort of throwing a shout out. This is a vertical pull to the Obama campaign, so it's attached itself to the Democratic Party for better or for worse. Right. But in the current context, of course, they're using it in the Women's March, and they've chosen to use someone who's wearing a veil so that they could sort of add this intersectionality to their approach of the Women's March. Anyways, so as always, you can check in with me. I know that this reading is really hard, but hopefully this has helped you sort of better understand how ideographs are functioning. And yes, thank you so much for listening, and yeah, have a great week.